There we go. We are recording this so that we can show it at later dates to those who would like to see it. So thanks for joining us on for most of us, a snowy Saturday morning. For one of us, it's a nice warm morning, but thank you for coming and being with us. Just to verify, this is the class entitled Trustees in the Presbyterian Church. So I'm assuming you're all on our list, so you're all in the right place. So we're going to do this. 11 o'clock is the worship segment, and your original email that came out, I believe it was from Craig Kunkel, has in the body of that email, it has a link to click on for 11 o'clock. And that would lead you into the worship for this afternoon. And then I don't know what session you have for class 2, but that starts at 11:30. So you want to go back to that original email again, and then that'll have the link for your second session in there as well. If you could, with your name, we're asking people to put the church that they're associated with, or presbytery, whichever you're associated with, just your name and then the dash and then the church that you're affiliated with, just so that we all know the different presbyteries that are represented and where everybody is coming from. A couple of notes. Please remember to mute yourself after you speak, just to drown out any background noise. That would be really helpful. If it comes to that, I may have to remind people, hey, please mute yourself, just so that that is okay. And then you'll get an evaluation at the end of this later this afternoon. Let us know how this went, what information you liked, what information you feel like you may still need at the end of this. Although I've seen Jim's presentation, I don't know if there's really any information out there that you don't have. We will have at the end of this a little Q&A. Jim did send out some discussion questions that we can engage, but also if there are other questions that you have, we can address those, because that's really important as well. Jim and I actually are together at Third Presbyterian Church. Jim has been there quite a while. I'm more recent there, but we are both on the Presbyterian Board of Trustees. I've been on for about 4 years now, the trustees, and Jim has been on for almost 2 years. And so, yeah, Jim, do you want to say anything about yourself before we get going?
I've been a Presbyterian trustee 2 years and trustee for Third Presbyterian. I'm in my 4th year, and also have served 3 years as either the property manager or now the chair of the property committee.
So again, thanks everybody for being here. If you can put your church with your name, that would be great. And if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat. As we go along, you can drop them in the chat or just write them down and save them for the end when we do the Q&A. So thanks all for being here on Saturday morning.
Okay, good morning to Ann.
Excuse me. Is it possible to edit the name while we have the session open, or?
Yes. Upper right corner of your window, you'll see 3 dots. If you move your cursor there. If you on your photo, see the 3 dots, upper right corner?
Yep.
Up your photo. So click there and you have the option to
Full screen, hide participants, hide view.
rename.
Gallery.
See rename at the bottom?
Nope.
Rename
No rename.
at the bottom of the drop down?
No, it says full screen, the bottom.
You should click on the button that says participants. That'll give a list of participants, and then you click on yourself, and then the rename should pop up. I'm using an iPad. That's the way it works on an iPad.
Okay, I see there's participants. Click on that.
And click on your own name,
Oh, okay, gotcha.
and then it should say rename.
No, it says mute, but there's 3 dots, so we'll try clicking that, see what that says. Rename, you got it. Okay, good.
Okay. And good
Thank you.
morning again to
I'm
Ann. I
sorry.
see Ann figured it out. Ann from Auburn is online with us too. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. There's Ann. And the title slide should be coming up for you. Now, can you see the title screen, everyone? Light green background?
Yes.
Yep, got it
Very
here.
good. Very good. So trustees in the Presbyterian Church. This is not the be all and the end all. It's the beginning for us as a group. So that you know, it's a workshop. It's not possible to have the entire scope and the entire depth in an hour and 20 minutes, as you are well aware if you've been a trustee for a while. So this is a broad overview. There's some background coming your way. There's some essential resources coming your way. There's lots of links and documents and examples from Third Church, because I know Third Church. But I am free to follow up and open to follow up after this. You will receive the slides, so you don't have to worry about that. A lot of the links are web links, so they will be live when you get the slides. Some of them are documents that are Third Church documents, so I will undo those links. They're links for me while I'm presenting, but they won't be links for you. But anything that you see today, any template or document that you might be interested in receiving, just send me an email later and I'll freely share it with you. So collaboration is the point. So some references coming your way, then background on the role of trustee, and then a whole hour spent on roles and responsibilities. I think I've chosen 8 to expound on a little bit. We should finish at about 10:30, which will give us 15 minutes for discussion questions. So first of all, references. I actually could stop after the next 3 slides, because these, in my opinion, are the essential references for trustees. If you've been a trustee, then probably you, like me, sat through the first several meetings hearing English being spoken, but not actually being able to connect the dots as to what actually it all meant. That certainly has been my experience when I moved to the Presbytery trustees. And so I understand. And in the last few years, I've been collecting these links, and I was able to put it together today and this morning for this particular presentation. But I commiserate with you if you're brand new. So reference number 1, in no particular order, the Legal Resource Manual for Presbyterian Church Councils and Churches. It's a 100-page document. It's kept up to date. You see in the left margin the sections and their titles. There is no section 8 or 10, oddly enough. It's almost like floor 13 not available on an elevator. For some reason, section 8 and 10 are missing. I don't know why. But from the legal standpoint, if you want the PC USA take on any situation that you're faced with, I would say go there first and just have a read, and you'll figure that out. I've spent a lot of time in section 9 over the past year as a project that I had for the Genesee Valley Presbytery involved the group insurance policy. So I'm well aware of the minimum recommendations for insurance, but each one of those sections is pretty meaty, and you will find lots of information there. And the live link is right there at the bottom of the page. So that's reference number 1. Reference number 2, the Book of Order. What looks like a lot of information actually only covers 3 pages. So I trust all of you will find an online version of the Book of Order, which, by the way, can be downloaded from the PC USA bookstore for free. And then you just have a PDF of the Book of Order, which you can quickly search. But there are 3 pages that explain from the General Assembly's perspective the overall scope of trustees. And then the final reference, which is what I followed to put together the structure of the rest of the workshop today, is this paperback book, The Presbyterian Trustee by Earl Johnson. Reverend Johnson actually spent some time at Pittsford Presbyterian in Rochester, so he's been through Western New York and most of the Northeast when I looked in the book at where he spent. It is a little bit old. It's from 2004. The only thing, though, that I found in the book, it's only 70 pages, so it's an easy read. The only thing I found that confused me a little bit is his references to sections in the Book of Order don't match today's Book of Order. So if you just ignore those, you're good. The rest of it, I think, is fine, and actually better than fine. It's really a good reference, an overall reference, not so much detailed, but an overall reference that covers the scope of a church trustee. And it's available from PC USA online bookstore for $10.40. So it's a deal. So those are the 3 references, which if any of those are new to you, check them out. And I think you'll see what I mean, especially reference number 1 and reference number 3. Between those two, you really are good. That's your library. And actually, we're not going to repeat any of that content because I know that all of you can read. So now you know the books you need on your digital shelf. The rest of the time will be spent, most of the rest of the time will be spent on examples of how Third Presbyterian has implemented some of the scope, most of the scope of being a trustee, right? So I wanted to provide examples to you, which you can leverage if you are looking for those particular things that we have to offer. And I also have some probably new material for you, and definitely as many links to helpful websites as I could find. All right, next, background. So when did, or I should say, does the role of trustee ever appear in the Bible? And the answer is yes, but not very often. And according to Reverend Johnson, I took this reference right from him. He said, not explicitly. So from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is verses 27 through 31. And this is where, right in the middle of this paragraph, the concept of some sort of structure to the church first appears. So it starts with, now you are the body of Christ. And if you see in the list there in the middle on the third line, then deeds of power, then gifts of healing, forms of assistance, forms of leadership, various kinds of tongues. So in my study Bible and in Reverend Johnson's book, forms of assistance and forms of leadership are what has evolved into the role of trustees. So yes, trustees does appear, but not explicitly, not the word or the Greek form of the word. That doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible, but this does. I added the sentence at the bottom. It links to verse 31 there, but strive for the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. The next chapter, chapter 13, is an explanation of that still more excellent way, which is the chapter that I know is part of my wedding, maybe part of your wedding, part of most weddings. I'll just leave that out there hanging so you can go and read it. But the greatest gift of all, he says, is love. This is Paul writing Corinthians. He says is love. And I put this here as a reminder to me, the speaker, and to you, not to forget when you're wrestling with a property issue, have to buy new boilers, the roof is leaking, all those kinds of trustee issues. Just remember, it's good to have someone on the committee ask, where is Jesus in this conversation, right? It's really easy to miss that point. And it's so easy that when somebody brings that up, when somebody says that, at least to me, it's almost shocking that we've spent 15 or 20 minutes wrestling with something and forgetting about maybe grace and kindness because the details have sucked us in. And just remember, step back and remember where you are and who you are and what you're there for on occasion before you get back to those important details. So when did the role of the word trustee, when did that begin to appear? So I found this nice reference in Dr. Johnson's book, and it actually links to the Synod, or is attributed to the Synod of New York almost 300 years ago, right, in the mid-18th century. It is Old English, so it's tough to read. The capitalizations and the spellings were copied for verbatim, just so that you know. So I will paraphrase it as I read along. It starts with a double negative, not inconsistent, which I will change to consistent. It is consistent with the Presbyterian plan of government that trustees should have the disposal and application of the public money, provided that they leave it in the hands and to the management of the deacons, what is collected for the Lord's table and the poor, and that ministers of the gospel, by virtue of their office, have no right to sit with or preside over such trustees or committees. So that was the thought process roughly 300 years ago. Reverend Johnson in his book then goes on to say that this led into the disestablishment discussion of the time frame between 1750 and 1800, leading to the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights in 1791, I believe, which we commonly refer to as a separation of church and state. So when those organizations were formally in the law separated, the concept of churches as corporate bodies arose, right? So that there was some form of governance, and you can't have governance of an organization without having somebody identified to keep track of the monies and the assets and the properties. And that is where the word word trustee first kind of came into the conversation in the United States, at least according to Dr. Johnson's book. It is Johnson. Yes, Earl Johnson. I have the book here, so I leaned down to pick that up. And then lastly, from the Book of Order. From those 3 pages in the Book of Order regarding trustees, I just copied verbatim some of the text and linked it together with 3 dots. The corporation so formed or the individual trustee shall have the following powers. So this is a description in the Book of Order of the scope of trustees: to receive, hold, encumber, manage, and transfer property, real or personal, for the congregation, provided that in buying, selling, and mortgaging real property, the trustee shall act only after the approval of the congregation. Also, to manage any permanent special funds, meaning endowment, for the furtherance of the purposes of the congregation, all subject to the authority of the session. So in our case at Third, and maybe in your case, we have a bicameral system where we have a separate board of trustees, but the decision-making body of the church still remains the session. And that's pretty clearly, I think, spelled out there in the text. And then secondly, here's this reminder again to ask where Jesus is in all discussions, a reminder that the property of the Presbyterian Church, USA, of its councils and entities, and of its congregations is merely, my word, a tool for the accomplishment of the mission of Jesus Christ in the world. So that's why the property and the grounds exist. We don't exist because of the buildings, but the buildings should serve the mission of the church. And just remember that. It's very important. Pause for questions, anyone? Feel free, by the way, to stop me at any time. If not, we'll go on. So roles and responsibilities. This word cloud that I have copied in there, it was meant to come out as a star. I chose a star, and you see the star also looks like a person, a Velcro person with their arms wide, their feet wide, and everything that isn't worship, music, or outreach is kind of stuck to the Velcro person, right? And that, in my mind, is kind of what it feels like to be on a board of trustees, because the operational aspects of the entity of the church is varied. The scope is varied. And in some of these issues, for example, liability or NIP MIFA or managing escrow or capital projects, you know, those can get quite deep in details, as I'm sure you are well aware. And just remember to pace yourself. You're running a marathon when you're a trustee and not a sprint. And some small thing can appear on the horizon at any time, which mushrooms into a pretty deep discussion about something, right? And that comes along with being a trustee. So I think we are like the Velcro person there, accepting all kinds of action items to keep the organization running. So this list then for roles and responsibilities is mostly, but not purely, but mostly found on page 39 in chapter 3 of the Church of Trustee book, Dr. Johnson's book. I embellished and combined a few things. I added a couple of things, but largely if you went to that paperback book and you went to that page, you would see, okay, well, this is the list directly as I referenced there from page 39. And I don't think there is a specific order. It's definitely not alphabetical. It's not an order of importance. It's just how Dr. Johnson wrote it. So we're just going to go through it in order. And actually, I chose 8. So the boxes there with the check mark, there will be 1, 2, or 3 slides on each of those in that order, top to bottom, coming up. That's what's ahead of us for the next 45 or 60 minutes, something like that. So let's go to maintain buildings, grounds, and equipment. So this is a standard title page that I use in each of those 8 sections. There's an objective, responsibility. Where it says resources, if there's a link after resources, those are web links. So when you get the actual slides, those will be links that you can use because they're just links to a web page somewhere. The links that you see there on this slide in examples are just to Third Presbyterian documents, and I will change those out to be just text. So they're not active links, which you couldn't use anyway, but I will show you examples. We're going to click on each one of those so you can see the documents. And I would say to you, because we're being collaborative here, if anything strikes your fancy as something you would like to have the whole document, just write it down and then communicate to me after that you would appreciate leveraging that, and I'll send it to you, no problem. All right, so maintaining buildings, grounds, and equipment. The goal is to maintain the integrity, appearance, and readiness of the buildings, which is a big scope. And then you add grounds and equipment therein, and it's a very large scope. The responsibility generally falls to a property committee or something of a slightly different title, but the same meeting. I know there are buildings and grounds committees. There are various names. Sometimes it falls on one or two shoulders of people who just have the energy, depending on the size of your church. At Third Church, we have sextons. You may or may not have those. We happen to be blessed with two, mostly full-time people for our 7-day-a-week operation. In terms of resources, it's just not possible, at least I found it not possible, to avoid hiring out some of the work. It's, churches don't know what's going on inside of them. They know their age and they know the weather, and that's what they react to. So things degrade over time, as I'm sure we are all well aware with older buildings, independent of what's going on inside, independent of the budget, roofs leak. So having good contractors at your disposal that you can trust to give you high value is very critical. And in my direct experience, implementing effective preventive maintenance programs are essential, because things like the roof, the walls, the heating plant, those are not things to run to failure. Sometimes it's okay. Maybe you have an ice machine in your kitchen, and you know that if your ice machine fails, you can go out and buy bags of ice and get by. But when the roof leaks, the roof is leaking, and generally leaking roofs result in our old buildings in plaster falling off the ceiling or the walls, which then contains asbestos, and now you have a mitigation effort and you need to replaster and re-roof. So don't go that route if you can help it. Preventive maintenance pays off in the long run. Roofing, masonry, siding, the mechanical, stained glass windows, and many more subsystems that are unique to your church. Preventive maintenance, if you can afford that, spreads out your maintenance costs through the years, as opposed to having lean years where you think everything is going great, and in reality you find out, well, you were just at the edge of the cliff, and then suddenly your roof starts to leak and you've fallen off the cliff, and now you have a $40,000 repair job you're faced with, and lots of angst and agony there. Do you agree with that, by the way? Does that resonate with you? Think that's true?
Jim, yes, it really, it definitely is true, but in tight budget times, it's hard to do as well at the same time.
Yes, it is. And that's always our challenge for all of us, independent of the size of the church or the congregation, for sure. All right, some examples. At Third, we host a lot of different events or groups of people using meeting rooms or events. An example is next Saturday, the part of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Rochester. They are marshaling their ponies, actually, the horse carts, in one of our parking lots. So, stuff happens all the time. We found it instrumental to create a building use policy, and we actually leveraged this policy. We sent out a note, and we got 4 or 5 building use policies from our Presbytery, different churches, as well as one from a church in Philadelphia, which for whatever reason we found to our liking the most. So we borrowed a lot of their building use policy and massaged it for our own use. I'll click on that. I should say that I think half the value of putting together documents like this is actually in the discussion required to actually put together your own document, and then the document has a life, but it forces the discussion. One of the very helpful things for us was to understand right at the beginning of the building use policy that we needed a mission statement. So when we get, and we fairly frequently receive requests to use the building or property, we first ask ourselves, is the use congruent with our own mission and vision for the church? And so far we haven't turned anyone away. Maybe once in the last 3 years have we turned someone away. But we go to this paragraph to make sure that the request is congruent. And that alone, I think that realization was an important part. I was on this particular subcommittee of writing this document. So in here, we define minimum insurance requirements, for example, for people using our property. We actually have begun looking at the property as a small source of revenue. So we for the last 20 years haven't been asking for rental prices, but now we are doing that again with sometimes we look the other way. We don't charge for recitals or recording sessions necessarily in our chapel, for example. Depending on the group, a nonprofit group, we wouldn't ask for money from. So here's a fee schedule, which we made sure was congruent with other organizations in our area of the city, for example. Again, the construction of the building use policy was just as valuable, I think, as having the actual policy itself. So this is something which is free for you to request, or is easy for you to request and leverage as much of it or none of it as you see fit. We have some forms here at the back, which helped us kind of bring order to this whole operation, a reservation and application form, and then this walkthrough review. So this came about after an insurance audit where they said, you're doing some risky things here, and you're not requesting necessarily insurance, nor are you providing any sort of safety orientation for groups on your site. So we have a simple walkthrough checklist now where we just point out to a group that's never been in the church before where the emergency exits are, where the closest fire extinguisher is, who to contact in case of an emergency, what to do if you hear the fire alarm. Just basic stuff, which we weren't doing, but now are doing. And again, that came out of the building of this building use policy. So I think it's a valuable exercise if you don't have something like this.
A question for you.
Yes.
As we all went through COVID and the rapidly changing state rules and laws and acts, as well as just safety of the church, how did you adapt this quickly to keep up with making sure all of your groups, or did you make sure all the groups using your church followed the church's COVID protocols?
Yes, choice B. Any human coming in followed our protocols, not their own, but ours.
So how did you communicate that, though? Because things were changing quickly to the various groups that were using the church. And what happened? Did any of them push back?
Good question. So hopefully, I assume my answer to part A is we adapted as well as anybody else on earth adapted, which was, it was tough, right? But yeah, we controlled people coming in and how they had to self-check on their way in. We communicated when masks were required, when not. We had signs on the doors, on every entry door, just reinforcing what was required, masking or not. We had some groups self-select out and some went along. So that was fine. For a while, you could meet, but you couldn't meet and eat. And then as numbers came down, we started to add eating. We basically followed CDC guidelines the whole time and New York State guidelines. And we were just lockstep with what those governing bodies in the Monroe County Department of Public Health, based on what color we were. And we still do that. I still check in weekly to see where Monroe County sits. And we adjusted accordingly. I can't say that we made anybody angry, I don't think. I think everyone understood. I was the COVID person, so I unfortunately know it well. Oh, here it is. Oh, I lost my place. Sorry about this. I think I clicked on the wrong thing. I did. We were here. So daily standard work, monthly standard work, sexton project list. So before I dive into these, because it takes some time, do you have employees at your churches? Is this meaningful to you, or is it all done by congregation members? What I mean is building maintenance, daily cleaning, daily maintenance would these be of value to you? Anybody, just raise your hand if the answer is yes. Yes, Ann, okay.
Yes,
right.
and all of the resources that you're showing are very valuable because I'm about to become the treasurer of the Cuyahoga Syracuse Presbytery. And there's just valuable information in here that you can help people to tailor to their own situation. I think, obviously you've done a great job with this.
Okay, well, thank you. And so I will. So we used to work just by word of mouth, and that just wasn't working for us adequately. So I'm a big proponent of having checklists and working with the people who are about to do the actual work on the format of the checklists, the content, the order. It's a valuable exercise just to do that. So we have one that you'll see here that governs our daily standard work for the day shift person, for example, based on the day of the week. Oh, this is the afternoon shift, but certain items that must be done every Tuesday, that must be done every Wednesday. Of course, there's more work than that to do, but this is the minimum. They initial and date the work, and it's easy to have a conversation when something wasn't done or they had an issue. They can right away, write in there that they had an issue with something. So that everybody likes the checklist, the people doing the work and the people responsible for the work being done. So I can't say enough about the helpfulness of that. It's tough for me to get back to the original presentation. There we go. Also, so that's daily. So that was what I just showed you, was week by the day by the shift. This is a monthly schedule. So churches also have cobwebs, for example. You don't need to clean those cobweb places every week. But in our case, we decided we needed to do that 3 times a year. So once every 4 months, at least, we will have touched every part of the church, and then we'll start over. So we were able to divide the church into 12 areas that you see here, color-coded into 4 groups of 3. And so in March, we are doing deep cleaning, we call it, on the 2nd floor of our education building in the lower level, and the external grounds and the courtyard. And we'll do that again in July, and we'll do that again in November. That's not to say that we can't do deep cleaning in between them either, but we will at least do it every 4 months. And we just have this rotating schedule that covers the entire church. I agreed with the sextons what those tasks would entail. For example, like I said, removing cobwebs, wiping horizontal surfaces, etc. As you are well aware, people who come to worship or come for a committee meeting are expecting a level of organization and cleanliness, and that doesn't come randomly, right? It's much better if you have standard cleaning by the shift, by the day, by the week, as well as on top of that, stuff that you do throughout the year, like extra special cleaning throughout the year.
Question.
Yes.
Outside groups using it, do you have certain requirements on the way they leave it after their activities so that your sexton doesn't constantly clean up after everybody else?
Yes, that's right in the building use policy. Yes, and it's clearly spelled out when we have a conversation with them. Yes, and we ask that basically they leave it as clean or cleaner, but as clean as when they found it, with all trash in the receptacle. So the sexton will empty the trash, and obviously the sexton will clean up anything they missed, but we ask them to leave it like they found it. Yes. Other questions? If not, we'll go back to the presentation. We also have a project list. So this has worked awesomely well for us to actually put tasks on a list for the sexton. So I would say things that are more than cleaning and less than a capital project for the property committee, that middle level, which constitutes lots of stuff. We have a list, and we have a prioritization rubric that you're going to see when I discuss capital projects. We use that same one for tasks. And I'm just going to go to the graphics here. I'm going to go to the tally. And this shows you what the sextons and the property manager, so I was the lead sexton, call it that, what we were able to accomplish over 3 years. So we said we closed 146 tasks. And I have to say, okay, we would have done some of those things by randomly in the past without the list. But I bet 100 of those were things that previously the sextons wouldn't even have thought was in their scope. And so over time, initially there were a lot of priority 1, 2, and 3 issues, with priority 1 being the most urgent and most important. And over time, as those bars dropped, the green bar increased, obviously, as we move things to the complete bucket. And this was a source of pride and passion and driving force, impetus to do more things, to make the green bar grow. It does work. I will explain the prioritization system later for you. Another value of this is to indicate the area of the church from where these tasks are coming from, and also the type of task, so you can get some idea over time. I'm just scrolling down through the list to some tables at the bottom of where most of your work stems from, us being mostly from the interior of the church, and maintenance items, items to improve the appearance and safety were kind of the top 3, at least for us. So that helped us understand where we should do more preventive work, because those areas were causing continued work and chaos for us. What things could we do that would be more preventive in those areas to knock down maintenance, appearance, and safety issues? The red ones, red is our top priority, the most important and most urgent. And you see some older ones. This list is oldest to newest. You'll see some ones in here which are pretty old. And those are, frankly, things we haven't been able to solve. And it happens, you know, so we carry a list of 6 or 8 level 1s that we haven't been able to resolve. Again, the value of the tool is the tool itself, but it is in the creation of the tool and the discussion in order to create the tool. It helps set the stage for how you wish the facility to be maintained. All right, I am going to move on then to the next slide, which is managing the church budget. I'm not going to talk about creating budgets or managing budgets. That is kind of well documented how to do that. I'm going to show some examples of graphically how to bring the budget alive, if you think of it that way. We, about 5 years ago, moved to an external accountant and an external independent auditor. Up to that point, we had done everything ourselves. Accounting was done by a staff member, and we really weren't doing audits. So we definitely have raised the bar. It has cost us some funds to do that for sure. But for a church our size, this has paid off dividends. We still have a treasurer, of course. The session still makes decisions. Trustees are involved. It is a joint effort still between these groups plus our external accountant to establish, monitor, and adjust the annual operating budget. So visual tools, I want to show you some examples. I have hardly ever met somebody who works with numbers who also works with graphs, who feels the need to graph it. I am sure you have been in meetings where you've seen tables of numbers, right? Black on white, lots of numbers, parentheses, meaning negative sign, and all those kinds of things. In my opinion, very rarely do tables of numbers actually drive understanding or action if needed. It's very difficult in your mind to plot the data and figure out when you have outlying numbers, when you have a trend, something like that. But it is quite simple to use those same numbers to create, for example, a pie chart at the top or a Pareto chart. Those two plots, simple plots, break down the property budget in ways that people can remember. So the message here, obviously in red, is, hey, we have a lot of fixed cost in our property budget. So our hands are pretty much tied with contracts, and our ability to reduce cost in the middle of a budget year really comes out of this blue part of the budget, the variable cost, which is only 20%. Somebody can remember that from a pie chart. Difficult for them to listen, understand, and internalize without a pie or a Pareto, which is a further breakdown of these pieces of pie. And then certainly following elements of your budget, a run chart with a goal line on there, in our case, a linearized goal line, really, really helpful. In this particular case, last year, this is real data, our building repairs fully exceeded our budget for repairs, but we had to do them because that's chaos, that demands that you do it. And here is a variance chart, which is kind of an up-down bar chart. Red bars are when you're overspending your budget. Red is warning. Green is good, right? We all think green is good, red is bad. Green is underspending, that's a good thing. It's just a simple way, a snapshot of where you are cumulatively through the year. So you can see, yes, we spent way over budget on our building repairs last year, and it was pretty much somewhat linear like through the year. And I can tell you, most of that was in the boiler room, where I kind of spent last year and parked in our boiler room on a whole variety of issues that haven't yet gone away. So, we're still riding that particular horse. My advice to you is make it visual. Bottom line is make it visual for your congregation, for your teammates, for your session, for your trustees. Turn the numbers into charts. You don't have to create a dashboard like this, but turn your numbers into charts in order to get action. We also have a contracts and purchasing policy, which I'll bring up. It's a one-pager, but actually it's really for us kind of a one paragraph document. And it stands out here, that number 2000. So for us anyway, we decided that any single expenditure for an expense or for a capital project more than 2000 had to be pre-approved by the Board of Trustees. And now we've amended that such that we have standard vehicles, which I'm about to show you. We have standard templates that need to be filled out before you bring one of those issues to the trustees. And after 3 years, the organization expects to see those documents. They know the flow of the documents, and it has made the whole pre-approval process more effective and more efficient. But it comes down to this number 2000, which I think was too low. We do it actually too often, and we're about to raise that, at least for our church. It's meaningful, but it covers everybody. Every expenditure goes through this process, goes through the Board of Trustees, and it didn't necessarily happen that way before we had this policy. So here's a template for an expense allocation request, which we call an EAR. Craig will see that I'm leveraging prior work stuff in most of these tools. So we have an expense allocation request called an EAR, and we have a capital allocation request called a CAR. And it's just a change to this particular word in the title. The templates are the same, but this forces everybody to write a problem statement, potentially include a photo in there to get people on board with a picture as opposed to words as to what the problem is, what the chosen solution is, the rationale for the contractor that was chosen, the cost, and the funding. So those are the 4 things, actually, all 4 of them that the trustees are approving. Before, it wasn't really clear. We had PowerPoint presentations, we had emails, we had just somebody standing up and talking. We had a little bit of everything. And of course, when you do things like that, you don't have standard flow, you don't cover all the bases. That's how it is. You have no record necessarily of some of the verbal issues. You may not have agreement, or you thought you had agreement, but you didn't have agreement on where the funds come from. For example, there can be budgeted funds and there can be off-budget funds. Off-budget funds being spending donations, maybe an insurance check. Maybe you have leftover funds from a previous fundraising event. You may have sold property or something, some other asset. You may have undesignated net assets at your disposal. This is where we propose, here's how we're going to fund the project, so that the trustees are also implicitly agreeing, okay, we're okay with that funding plan. When we're done with that, we assign a specific project number to the project. We move in an accounting fashion the funds that were approved, and then we invoice against that project number. Before
Question for you.
Yes, Bob.
Treatment of budgeted versus unbudgeted. The way we tend to work is you put together the budget. Different committees have a certain amount of budget. Buildings and grounds has a certain amount. And if it's within their budget, whether it's 500 or 5,000, that they take care of it. It does not go back we don't have a Board of Trustees. It would all be session.
Yes.
Because it was pre-approved. Do you still fill out this form even for budgeted items?
No, we do not. So back in that purchasing policy, any expenditure below 2,000, as long as it's budgeted, as long as it's within the budget. And for us, that's too low of a number. But anyway, we're learning the hard way. Yeah, that just is able to get spent. So we click into the formal process after a certain minimum amount.
Okay.
Only.
But it doesn't matter if you budget. Let's just say you knew you had to replace tiling for $7,000. You put that in the budget. you still would then fill this form out above and beyond the budget?
Yes, because the process requires us to do diligence in choosing contractors. So we have to show that we did diligence to get multiple quotes. We have said that we need to do diligence to include, if possible, a certified MWBE, a quote from a minority or women-owned business. So that is part of the review of the trustees. And so this document forces that. Also, I have to say, it's good, I think. Well, first of all, I'm glad you have a process. The most important thing is you have a process and you have one. So that's great. Showing people with a picture of what's actually going on in your basement, for example, or out in your tool shed, or all those places that most people don't go, is also valuable. And this forces that to happen. So, you know, you win people onto the view of your property and the folks who take care of your property by going through the process. That's the value of it. Other questions? No? Okay, we'll move on to formulating long-term capital plans. So 3 slides here. The objective is to ensure the continued vitality of the property. I was thinking, what is the one word that kind of envelopes everything? And the word is vitality, right? So to me, that encompasses the usefulness, the integrity, the appearance of the property, the readiness of the property, vitality. And that actually is the Matthew 25 word, the vitality of the congregation. There is also vitality of the property. Purely the responsibility of the property committee, the sextons, the trustees. So here's where I'll go through the rubric that we use. Again, I think it's important to have a process. You may like or dislike this process, it's fine. And that leads into our long-term capital plan, and then a CAR for capital request. So this is borrowed from my previous work life, something that I created back then. This has 4 quadrants. There's the vertical axis is the axis of importance. So we separate potential expenditures based on their relative importance, high or low, relative to each other, and their relative urgency, high or low. So things that end up with relatively high importance and high urgency are in that upper left quadrant, which is our quadrant 1. Those are the must-dos. Those are the chaos that drive work, right? The roof is leaking. We must fix it now. We have no choice kind of things. Over in the should-do quadrant, quadrant 2, these are important things, but relatively low urgent. So maybe your roof isn't leaking, but the flashing clearly is frayed and needs to be replaced to prevent a roof leak. So you would like to spend the most of your dollars and time in the should-do quadrant in order over time to have less must-dos to reduce the chaos. So borrowed from Stephen Covey, actually. How do you get more time to work on the quadrant 2s? You do less of the quadrant 3 items, which are of relative low importance, not non-important, just relatively less important, but for some reason are made to feel urgent. So the items down there are ones which you're okay with putting off for a while, because all of the reasons to put things off, including funding, lack of people, etc., or issues that can be delegated. You might have somebody who really is passionate about a particular issue. They might be driving the urgency. If they're able to execute it, that's great. You don't need to get your entire committee involved in that. Maybe it's a one-person job. But this is the place, well, already you're ignoring the low important, low urgency ones. That's taken for granted. Do less work, or try to identify the quadrant 3 items, which I call could do, to make more time for the should do's in order for the must do's to, over time, decrease. So on our team, we use this language, quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3. For the congregation, we say must do, should do, could do. And what that looks like, oh, there's one other aspect to our capital plan. So in combination with the rubric, we identified 9 categories where capital projects flow from. These are just in alphabetical order. So accessibility improvements, appearance, functionality, integrity, anything driven by Matthew 25, any issue with the sacred elements like stained glass windows of the church, safety, security, and utilities. What we did was we brainstormed each one of these separately and then took the list of items, the potential improvements, and prioritized those using the rubric on the previous page. And then we populated this. This is just a copy right from the template. So this is quadrant 1, this column, this is quadrant 2, this is quadrant 3, and you see the categories down in the left margin: accessibility, appearance, functionality, etc. And this allowed us to do diligence, honest diligence in each of these 9 categories. So that gave us the scope and somewhat the depth. We populate also an estimated cost in there, plus or minus 50%, just something to get into Yankee Stadium. So we have an idea of where we're spending our money, where we need to spend our money, both across the matrix and down. Very, very helpful. Also, I start to shade blue the items where we have actually completed projects, so we can show people, hey, this is where we're working. So this has worked very, very effectively for us. And if I go back, I'll show you actually the actual capital plan. And I'm just going to page down through it so you can see a couple of things. I wanted to show you over here where I have the cursor here. This is the sum of the estimated cost by category. This whole thing adds up to, for us, $4.5 million or so. And here we go, about $3.3 million in the integrity category, which is for us roof and masonry. So also I have a nice bar graph that's linked to this, a Pareto chart, so we can show people, integrity is where we think we're going to need to spend the most of our money. And we haven't done a lot of work there. You can see a little bit of blue and a whole sea of white here. And why haven't we worked there? It's because we've been up in quadrant 1 working in the boiler room, right? So this is a way that graphically you can show people where you've worked and where you need to work. It's a pretty simple tool. And again, it's not the best tool, but it is a tool that forces a broad and deep discussion. So I'm a fan of process because of that value. It's not so much the mechanics of the spreadsheet, for example. We're not using the power of the spreadsheet here. We're using the power of facilitating a discussion. All right. This drop-down menu at the top keeps getting in the way. Here we go. Sorry, got off track there. Capital. Yes, so that's all I had to say about long-term capital plans. So if there's no questions, I'm on to managing finances, gifts and investments. Ensure the appropriate handling of financial resources involving the trustees, the treasurer always, and you may or may not have an investment committee, maybe an investment person, it depends. We had chose to use about 5 years ago, an external investment manager. Up to that, we had managed our own investments. We decided we didn't want personalities and people feeling bad about investments going south and all those things that happen. So we moved to a local, for us, external investment manager. So some resources. There is an Office of Faith-Based Investing. If your congregation is interested in faith-based investing, there is an office for that in PCUSA, and that links to the Presbyterian Foundation, and you can get to a faith-based investment firm that way, if you so desire. If you're familiar with ESG, SRI, and impact investing, or I should say, if you're not familiar, here's a nice explanation in Investopedia, which I find is a great kind of like Wikipedia, Investopedia for financial matters, gives great, clear explanations of things. And I found this for ESG, you might know, as environment, social, and governance. That may or may not resonate with you and your church. This is socially responsible investing, and then impact investing. There's overlaps between these and differences. Too much, we don't have enough time now to go into those, but this is a good place to get started if you're curious on the differences between those. And I have a checklist coming up. And then there's NIP-MIFA for those of us in New York State. I assume every state has something like these regulations. This is a hot link to NIP-MIFA, which are the requirements now for managing true endowment, which are endowment funds in perpetuity, and how you must handle those. How you get your draw every year. There are a series of 8 or 10 questions that every time you make a decision that affects your in perpetuity funds, you have to show diligence that you have not ranked, but you have applied all of those 8 or 10 requirements in NIP-MIFA against your decision. So we just have a simple form. once a year when we decide what the draw from the endowment will be to help out with our annual operating budget for the next year. We make sure that we can rationalize and justify the draw amount versus the NIP-MIFA guidelines, because of course, as you would expect, they are to help you maintain after inflation the principal amount so that you don't lose purchasing power over time on those funds, which are meant to be there in perpetuity. So that's NIP-MIFA NIP-MIFA in a nutshell. It's not an easy document to get through, but there's a link to it. On top of that, we have our own gift acceptance policy in a small committee. When gifts arise, to determine whether those match the mission and vision of our church and whether we will actually accept the gift or not. We have at least one time in the last few years actually rejected a gift or actually converted the usage of the gift, worked with the donor in order to help them direct their gift towards our priorities and realities, put it that way. So that's again, another example of having a process. It's not so much the document as having a process. And lastly, we have an investment policy. It's quite long. It's about 20 pages. I know that subcommittee, I wasn't on it, but I know that they leveraged that document from many other documents that they got from other churches. So if you don't have one, you could start with ours. Not saying it's the best, it's just already pre-leveraged, and it's a starting point if you don't have something. And again, for us, that investment policy also governs how we determine to make a draw, how we manage the draw financially, like what account it goes from, and then how we move funds from the draw account into a checking account to actually pay the bill. So it sort of governs, it states how cash flow is actually managed at the church. It's more than just investments. And here's a here's a checklist with pertinent investment decisions, which you're probably aware there are many decisions to make, and they're varied decisions. So first of all, how are you going to allocate your funds? How are you going to align your investment strategy with the personality, let's say, of the church? Are you going to get into ESG funds? There's choices. There's exclusionary and inclusionary funds. If you don't know what that means, there's an organization that applies an ESG score to every business that is publicly owned. And so there's a normal distribution of scores. An exclusionary fund excludes companies in the low end of the distribution. In the tail of the distribution would be companies with poor environmental, social, and governance scores, for example. So you would exclude them from that particular mutual fund. Inclusionary, typically I have seen, whereas an exclusionary fund may have 500 or 700 funds in it because you're knocking out a tail, the inclusionary funds have 40 or 50 funds, the top 40 or 50 scoring companies. And if you go that route, you're really saying, you know what, I think, number one, we buy in sort of ethically with high environmental, social, and governance funds, and we also believe we'll get good returns from that. So we're doing two, it's a win-win for the church, unless the markets say otherwise. For example, energy companies are doing well now, including oil producing companies. And I know you can find a PC on that Office of Faith-Based Investing site in PC USA. You scroll down and you can eventually find a list of companies that PC USA would recommend that we do not invest in, except sometimes weapons manufacturers are going great, are doing well as they are now, and so sometimes you give up return. It's up to the individual church. Socially responsible investing is choosing particular companies to invest in based on the output of that company, and impact investing is a smaller subset of SRI. So impact investing might be something like a company that makes solar panels or windmills, companies that are doing something to help the climate, if that is something that your church is interested to help. So there's lots of good discussion, interesting discussion there, just in these bullet points, let alone the things that typically people get into, like, well, what ratio of equity to income do we want for the long term? Domestic to international, the type of fund, index funds, managed funds, sector funds, for example, and also the signal for rebalancing. How far does our portfolio have to get away from our chosen equity to income ratio before we decide to rebalance? Also, what's our draw percentage? How often do we do that, and from what balance? We do what is pretty common in the financial industry is we withdraw quarterly, and we withdraw based on the trailing 20-quarter average. So it's a 5-year moving window of quarters, 20 quarters, basically to even out the peaks and valleys in the market performance, to kind of even out our cash flow to our budget, since the draw from the endowment plays an important role in the budget. And so that's some, at least. It's probably 80% of the kinds of things that you have to ask yourself. And all of those there's guidance for us for all of those in our investment policy document. Questions? Bob.
A quick question on the gift end. When a gift fits in your needs and it comes in and it's substantial, do you tend to invest that in a separate fund, separate account, so you can keep track of? Let's just say someone gave you $50,000. That's something you're not going to put in a checking account.
Well,
how do you, or you might, depending when you were going to spend it. But if it was something that's for a longer term, someone gave it to you as a scholarship fund to send kids to Camp Whitman, and you want to put that in a recurring fund, do you keep that in a separate account so that you can track it, or do you put it in with all the other investments? So
2 answers. If it's donor directed, that's true endowment, and that has to remain the principal. The NIPMIFA concept is that remains the principal, keeps its purchasing power in perpetuity. So we're not dropping that into a checking account. The board designated funds is up to the board to spend how the board sees fit, the Board of Trustees sees fit. And so it could go into a checking account if it's for an active roof leak. We have a roof leak and somebody wants to donate part of the cost, for example. That would skip any long-term investment vehicle, which we might have, and go to, let's say, a money market fund today. So it depends. But, there are different avenues for the different types of funds, and that, by law, you have to direct it, you have to keep track of it, I should say, based on how the donor wants it to be used. Then part B of the answer is, okay, so where does it actually go? So we co-mingle our investments. So we don't have investments that are just the in perpetuity, and the ones that are board designated. They are in the same investments managed by our advisor, but on a spreadsheet, they're separate. So we keep track of it that way, which we have to, but they're invested in the same vehicle. Then we withdraw, we commingle that, so that when we draw for our annual operating plan, we don't differentiate from the board designated funds which ones were for property or worship, music and arts, or just anything. We just take the draw from the commingled board designated funds. And that's clearly spelled out, I hope clearly spelled out in that investment policy. I believe I will find that it is clearly spelled out in the investment policy. And we didn't used to do it that way. So it took some number of years to undo what had been done in the past to make it clear. That was done 5 to 10 years ago only. Considering a 200-year-old church, I'm not sure, what took so long, but it's been very helpful to undo those. All right. Obtaining insurance. 2 slides here. So the purpose, the objective, reduce the financial impact of property and liability losses. Responsibility falls squarely on the shoulders of the trustees, and for a church that's a member of at least the Presbytery of Genesee Valley, it falls on the shoulders of the Presbytery trustees, since most, but not all, of the churches in the Presbytery are on the group policy. I'm not sure if every Presbytery does it that way. I'm sure it's fairly common. I just don't know. The churches aren't required to be part of the group policy. They can seek their own policy. I have some data coming up here, which tells an interesting story, but we offer it as an option for churches. If you go to section 9 of the PCUSA Legal Resource Manual that we saw back in an early slide, section 9 is all about insurance, and that tells you all that you need to know regarding the minimum recommended guidelines or amounts of coverage for all the different types of liability insurance for shore, and also property is covered there as well. Those guidelines are parroted very closely, but not exactly, into something that's similar and actually a little easier to read, which we're going to go visit in a moment, at the Northeast Synod's website. So I'm going to go there now because I think this is just a little bit clearer, but certainly what's available from PCUSA in the Legal Resource Manual is more comprehensive. So this is a 3-pager. We won't dwell on the amounts, just know that they start with liability insurance and they suggest amounts. One big difference is, I know, in the umbrella liability. So I want to remember to point that out when I get there. But anyway, there are recommended limits for general liability, recommended, what do I want to say, coverage within the general liability, like, for example, directors, officers, and trustees coverage. On page 2, they go to different types of liability vehicles, endorsements. Here's one place where I noticed that the Synod and PCUSA differ quite a bit. The Synod is recommending everybody carry a minimum of 1 million of umbrella liability, which lies on top of your general liability. PCUSA's value is $10 million. I looked into $10 million of umbrella liability for at least our church. That would cost $5,000 of premium, which we decided not to pay, but we did add, for us, large church, $4 million of umbrella on top of the general liability offered by the group policy in order to cover our endowment fund. So our goal just recently was to have enough liability insurance to at least match roughly our endowment fund to protect that in the event of a lawsuit. Two other things I want to point out. The Synod wants everyone to have replacement coverage, full replacement coverage on buildings and contents. So if your church subscribes to the group policy offered by the Genesee Valley Presbytery, that's automatic. That insurance automatically matches, by definition, all of the requirements of the Synod. And then lastly, I want to point out this position statement, which is worth a read. It basically says that your choice on how to insure your church, although if you decide, if you're in the Genesee Valley Presbytery, if you decide to go it out on your own, you have to have your policy pre-approved by the Presbytery trustees, And also, if you still end up short, read paragraph 2. It will therefore, if you're short of the minimum, be the policy of the Synod that it will not voluntarily participate in the settlement of legal actions brought against lower governing bodies unless that governing body carries the minimum recommendation. So there is a bit of risk if you decide to go it alone and go it on the short side, but the Presbytery trustees would not approve of that anyway. So this is, I would say, quicker to read than what's in the legal guide at the PCUSA website, but it is more comprehensive for sure. All right. So asterisks there. Please consider endorsements for umbrella liability, commercial liability, which mostly includes funds for recovery from cyber attack. One church in our presbytery within the last 2 years has been hacked. Several $1,000s were removed from their funds, and our insurance agent was hacked in the last couple of years. So it does happen. That was a small church, by the way, so it doesn't apparently matter who you are, what funds you have, etc. Cyber attack is a real thing that's happening, and you should consider adding an endorsement for this. We don't have that included in the Genesee Valley group policy. We left it as an endorsement since every church is different in their resources and what they think is their liability. Also relevant natural disasters. There are areas prone to flood and earthquake in Western New York, so don't ignore that. At least have have a thought about that. Next, I want to show you what I think is what this session is all about. This is a workshop, and I mentioned that at the beginning, we should be collaborating. And so here we're going to collaborate. So you know that it's a good idea to get multiple quotes. I know that you know that. You probably don't know what I didn't know when I led this project for the Presbytery trustees, is that different companies, even insurance companies, faced with the same valuations for churches can arrive at different levels of premium for a church of the same valuation. So these dots are all churches, and they all have different valuations. And these two companies, provider A and provider B, quoted on the group policy for these churches, all from the same valuation. So that's not an independent variable. There was not an independent variable in their calculation. The dots that lie on the line, this is the 45-degree line. So dots that lie on the line, it didn't matter whether provider B or A were chosen for the group policy, they were going to pay the same premium either way, right? Makes sense? However, you see there's quite a few churches that lay on the right side of this line. So let's pick out this church as a pretty big outlier. Were we to choose provider B, they would have paid about $17,000 for their premium. Were we to choose provider A, they would have paid $27,000. It would make a big difference to that particular church. There were enough churches on this side of the line such that we had to choose provider B. The overall policy from the Presbytery standpoint was lower by $40,000 or $50,000 and roughly 14%. So that's not something we could ignore. And it definitely didn't affect a bunch of churches here at the bottom, but affected quite a bit of churches out here in the distribution. This particular church, prior to any of this, already was looking to move their policy and were multi-quoting individuals, and they chose provider C, not A or B, and they moved their premium down from roughly $17,000 to somewhere in this neighborhood. So, you know, you can go that route too. But I thought this was interestingly enough to share with you, just as a reminder that the multi-quoting process is important. And I would suggest, having gone through this, including multiple agents who themselves rep for multiple companies, so that you get a good variety of broker or agent and company. PCUSA recommends 3 particular companies, so you'll have to go to their website to read that. They collectively write policies for 6 or 7 or 8,000 Presbyterian churches across the USA. So they do a lot of business. They know the minimum requirements very well for
Question.
Yes, Bob.
Frequency of multiple quote. When you're in a smaller church, and in Geneva, there is no Presbytery overriding policy you sign up on. You're on your own. You have the guidelines from the Presbytery. You have the minimums, what needs to be included, but you go out and you find your own. At a smaller church, the resources to do this type of quoting every year is pretty significant. Is there a recommendation or thought of, every 3 years, every 5 years, go back and get multi-quote if you're happy with an insurance company, assuming you're happy with them?
So the answer, like all my other answers, is it depends. And I understand your situation. So I think currently in the economic environment we're in, with inflation increasing and therefore replacement costs changing, and therefore the valuation of your property is changing, driven mainly by replacement cost, it makes sense to requote more often. Or you could play it the other way, sign a contract for 3 years as opposed to 1. But you should take economic considerations into play. What I have learned in this process is that the size of your church matters, the extent of fire coverage, fire protection matters, the materials of construction matter a lot. Remember that the insurance company is covering themselves for total loss. So they're concerned with total burn, something like that. So if you have a wood structure versus a stone structure, that's going to matter. Where your church is located, the county matters, and I don't know which county matters more or less, but that does matter. It's a New York State rule, actually, that matters. The location of the church relative to the nearest fire department matters, and also whether it's a volunteer fire department or a full-time 24/7 fire department. All those things matter. A lot of those things you have no control over. In fact, most of those things you don't have full control over, but you do have control over the frequency that you go out and requote and whether you do it at all or not. So I would say inflation being what it is, just take that into account. For example, Third Church's valuation more than doubled in this process because all the valuations were refreshed for current property values. Now they didn't double the premium, but the premium was increased for sure due to that. And that's a good thing because if your valuation is only half of what it would cost and you happen to have a big loss, a complete loss, you're stuck without a current policy. It's based on your current valuation. So it all comes back, I think, to inflation being the thing that you need to keep track of the most. Yeah. All right, almost done. And I don't want to give this short shrift, and I'm glad we're here at 10:15. So we have 15 more minutes. I know, well, let me step back. I hope that you are taking security and safety issues as serious as they are. Not necessarily natural for a church to do this, but rest assured there are lots and lots of very good resources for you. I realized when first assuming the property manager role at Third that we were all concerned for sure about safety and security, but the responsibility didn't really reside with any one person. And so I asked for it to reside on the shoulders of the property manager and therefore with the trustees as part of the scope of the trustees, which I think fits. Remember the word cloud with arms stretched out and legs stretched out? You know, that's one of those things that stick to the Velcro there. So responsibility, trustees, property committee, sextons. This first link is your go-to. I'm not sure if you even know about CISA. I didn't. That's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Administration. It's a subset of the Department of Homeland Security. There are a lot of government resources, and this security guide for houses of worship, along with their webinars, once you get on their mailing list, they have at least monthly webinars. There's an annual. Did you know in November? I think November is the security month for houses of worship from the government perspective. And there are a bunch of webinars weekly. I think it is November. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. There will be somebody in your church who's interested in this, and I highly recommend that at least one person get involved. Now, you know, this is a pretty between the eyeballs kind of title here, mitigating attacks on houses of worship. I would say look at the tagline here, security guide, and take it as a really good reference for security against natural disasters. You're in worship and the fire alarm goes off. You're in worship and your cell phones go off. You're under tornado warning. Does everyone know where to go? Do you know what to do? Have you thought about it? Have you practiced it? You know, maybe not. I know that we haven't. So this is worth all of its 116 pages. I want to go to one particular page, which is page 101 in the appendix. Not only do you have roughly 100 pages of slides and text, you have many, many pages of links here. Let me increase this so you can actually read that. There's all kinds of links in here to many, I said there's many tools. This is why this particular document is one-stop shopping. It's done really well. And what it's going to direct you to do, the very first thing, is to fill out their self-assessment tool. There is a self-assessment tool somewhere in here, which I am not seeing right away. But the self-assessment tool forces you to just answer straightforward questions about your facility from a security and safety standpoint. And then it says, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. And for example, where I worship, we need to have an emergency action plan, and we don't have one, right? So we don't have direction on what would we do if there's a tornado coming, or You know, if there's an active shooter, what would we do? How would we act? What do we do in case of a fire? We don't have that written down and we haven't practiced it, but we're about to, over the next year to two, create our own action plan. If you are interested in one of these webinars, I met in the chat box somebody who's written a book, 4 Houses of Worship, on how to create emergency action plans. She is a member of a church outside of, or in Baltimore, I should say in Baltimore. And she sent me the 40-page emergency action plan that she led to be authored for their particular church. Awesome person, awesome resource. I haven't looked at the book, but I can link you to those resources so that you know. That is one good place to start. And I would say, please don't assume that nothing can happen like that at your church. There's enough evidence now that we know that that's not an accurate statement. Going back, sorry. Also, the Department of Homeland Security Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. I'm not going to click on that now, but that also is where you can get your name on a mailing list and you can be part of their upper level mailing list. They are at a higher level, so their message is above and beyond sort of tactical things at your church to improve safety and security. Strategically, you ought to know your local police department. You ought to know the neighbors in your neighborhood, and they should know you, personally. You ought to have a relationship with your local offices of emergency preparedness that are part of the government. So not only do you know what would happen in the case of a flood, let's say, or a tornado warning, or an active shooter in your neighborhood. What if you get a warning to go into lockdown? Do you know what to do? Do people have responsibilities to just simply lock the doors? Simple thing that could greatly influence the outcome of that situation. Do you know what to do? Have you practiced it on a Saturday, for example? Those are kind of the simple upper level things that really all of us, and this is just Jim as a person, fellow parishioner, is saying to you. It's not a formal directive anywhere. It's just, me to you. But anyway, that's what the conversation and the materials available directly from the Department of Homeland Security are about. All right. One example is a walkthrough checklist. So I mentioned this before, linked in our building use plan, or building use policy, is a very simple walkthrough checklist. We realized after evaluating, doing a risk analysis of safety in our church, we weren't telling people who are new to the church or new groups or events where the emergency exits were, where the fire extinguishers are, how do you get to an elevator? Just basic stuff that goes a long way to ensure their safety. Who do you call? Where is the AED? Who can use it? Who on the staff is certified in CPR? Those are basic sort of blocking and tackling tactics to have a safer environment for everyone. So we put together this checklist and we walk it through with a group before the first time that they're in the church. Easy stuff that gets you a long way. So here's 8, I think, bullet items for improving security and safety. And this is my summary of everything I've heard, that I've read. We've had a security assessment by the Rochester Police Department. So I kind of put everything together and I said, this is what I hear, irrespective of the source. So let's take security, engage with the immediate community, monitor your exterior, light the parking lots, keep exterior and then the next level, the secondary doors locked as much as possible. Test your building alarm points. If you have a burglar alarm, make sure it works at least annually, all the points. Refresh your entry codes. Make sure you know who you've given keys to. Get those keys back when they no longer are a volunteer or they leave the church or whatever. Churches aren't necessarily good at keeping track or not necessarily good at changing their key codes. Use random numbers. Don't use the last 4 digits of the church phone number. That's a giveaway. Don't use 1, 2, 3, 4, and don't think that 4, 3, 2, 1 is kind of a fancy code. It's not. Use a random number. We had all those situations, by the way. No longer do we have those. Key aspects to improving safety. Complete that self-assessment. Create an emergency action plan. That will point out your weak points. Practice certify people in AED and CPR. Have some first aid kits on that aren't 20 years old on hand, and have signs that let people know where they are. Reduce slip, trip, and fall hazards. According to OSHA, that's 40 or 50% of what happens in businesses, the kinds of accidents that happen in businesses or organizations, people slipping, tripping, or falling. You have to service your fire alarms and extinguishers annually by code, right? You won't pass your local fire inspection if you don't, and provide safety orientation for all contractors. And I want to show you, I believe this is my second to last slide, just some examples. So within a year, after we applied safety film on our plate glass windows, of which we have many, safety film is a fraction of the cost of installing true safety glass. It's just for, in our case, 4 mil thick PET film. I put that in there for Craig, by the way, PET film. Another use for PET film, Craig, adhered to the inside of the plate glass. And look, somebody picked up a cobblestone from our landscaping, chucked it at a window one Friday night, and the safety film did its job, which was, yeah, it's not going to prevent the glass from breaking, but the cobblestone didn't go through, that person didn't get in, and the shards of glass didn't go flying into the church. So safety film is advertised to withstand 40 whacks from a blunt instrument. And you can see here, this is almost an advertisement for safety film at a fraction of the cost of true safety glass, relatively quick and easy for contractors to apply. Also, consider upgrading your first aid kits. This happens to be one of several first aid kits, but this is our enhanced kit where we have a Red Cross first aid kit inside this big red tackle box. But we also have 2 important phone numbers: poison control, the national 988 mental health support hotline. We have a trauma pack which has special items in there to quickly resolve severe bleeding, not just Band-Aids. This is gauze treated with clotting factor. We have an oximeter in there. We have a stethoscope. We have a blood pressure cuff down low in case you have professionals in your congregation, nurses or doctors who know how to use those. And now we have Narcan, 2 doses of Narcan. You understand the issue with opioid overdose. You can buy that without a prescription, and I see potentially almost soon you can just buy it off the shelf. So I just went to a local pharmacy and was able to purchase that with my insurance card. So Narcan is important. It's not difficult to administer. And you never know when you're going to be in the position to save someone's life, which that will. Lastly, the last 2 slides, and then we go to our discussion questions. If you have any issues with property transactions or you need legal representation, this is where that next level of trustees come into play. So Ted is currently the Genesee Valley chair for the Presbytery trustees. I'm a member. You have people on there that deal with broad across the Presbytery issues. And if you click on this link, it will take you to helpful documents that let you know when you need to involve Presbytery trustees. Now, a very, very last slide. Here are the responsibilities for the Board of Trustees at the next level. And by the way, there are trustees at the synod level and the General Assembly level, so it keeps rolling up and the scope keeps expanding. The bottom line here, and I have one last minute before 10:30, is anytime you are contemplating any sort of improvement to your property or any sort of capital campaign, any sort of sale, any sort of purchase whose cost is 25% or greater than your income for the year, that's where you're required per procedure to get your Presbytery trustees involved. We have processes for that. That kicks in processes that need to be followed. So we have neighborhoods. We have 2 trustee liaisons per neighborhood. So each neighborhood is about 10 particular churches out of the Presbytery. And so every neighborhood of Presbyterian churches in the Genesee Valley Presbytery have liaisons. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted to lead the discussion session.
I want to change the view here for those who are watching this on the recording. So what questions have popped up for you at this point after the information Jim has shared? Are there things like, hey, I really need to know about this? Just give you a second here. What questions do you have? Yeah, Ann, go ahead.
I just have one question for comparison's sake, because I know somebody's going to ask, what is the square footage of Third Presbyterian Church's total facility?
I will let you know. I don't have that off the top of my head. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Ours is 27,000, but I just wanted to, I know that people in Westminster will ask me that. Westminster does most of this, but I think you have some methods that maybe would make it easier.
Okay.
So that was the
Alright.
other reason I was saying, please share the Third Presbyterian documents with the group whenever you can. Anything you don't share, we'll just know that you didn't feel you could. I will not show them to a lot of people, but there are a few.
Okay.
Yep, thanks, Ann.
Thank you.
Question. Do you guys have, so we have obviously the building sanctuary offices, a lower level, but we also have a separate education wing that was built, I want to say the 60s maybe, but it's got 3 levels there too. So that's included in our square. I don't know. Do you guys have something like that?
That's the total square footage, and I was looking at pictures of everybody's churches while we were doing this, and I think that most of these churches have a fellowship hall, a education building, whatever, church house, whatever they call it, because they are quite long and or wide and extensive.
Right. Okay. All right. Any other questions? We do have some discussion questions which we can get into, but I want to make sure that we have at least addressed any specific questions you have for your congregation or your presbytery. Yeah,
I don't
Bob, do
know
you
how
have your
much
hand up?
experience people have in combining physical accounts in order to put different funds in the same physical account. But I started at First Presbyterian Church in Auburn years ago with some 36 physical accounts and got them down to about maybe 8 tops. That's important to do, but it takes a lot of time to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and yes.
Bob, did you have your hand up? Can't tell if he's-
Most of our churches do not have the resources to develop all of these spreadsheets, charts. I moderate churches with 15, 20 members. I'm a member of a church with 100 members. So these are a lot of neat ideas, but I was wondering what your thoughts were from experience on prioritizing of those 8 or 10. Which ones, I hate to say, are the most important, but when you only have so many people, you have to pick and choose. So just thoughts on that.
Did you mean of the 8 or 10 security or safety items, Bob? Or the scope items? You were breaking up.
Yeah, I think Bob is frozen. That's okay.
He looks frozen. Yeah. Can't tell.
And so, Bob, you're frozen, but we could continue this discussion offline. You could email it to me and I could respond, and I'll respond to everyone.
So, yeah, so while we're waiting for Bob, if he pops back in, we can begin to address that. Do you have practices that you're already doing in your congregation or your presbytery that are effective, that would help us to share with other folks? What are you doing that's like, this is working great for us?
The Cayuga Syracuse Presbytery has exactly 4 people and soon to have 3 people who are the finance and property work group. And that's the only body we have that represents trustees. So we're looking for another. The treasurer wishes to step away, which he travels a great deal. So, and he wants to focus on that work. So we are definitely looking for another volunteer. This is a lot of work for 3 or 4 people to do at the presbytery level. And at the church level, someone's already mentioned that the shortage of labor is very, very great. I think the most important thing is to have those checklists for the daily work and the cyclical work, as it were, that is done either annually or quarterly. And Westminster has lists, but I think that the format that Third is using could save us a lot of time. And I think that our people will quickly agree, and we happen to have people with the skill to create those sheets. But if you can share your live spreadsheets too, Jim, because that way you don't have to recreate the
You bet.
spreadsheet. And for the graphical work, I think that's extremely important at the Presbyterian level, and the church level helps too. And again, my cousin owns an investment company in Syracuse, and he said he would do that kind of thing for me, but I just don't have time. I have a full-time job, which makes me terrified to even take this on, but.
Mhm.
And
I'm
do you
really
guys
curious
have
too,
a
Jim.
separate, do you have a separate committee as part of the Presbytery that does the budget, or do those 3 or 4 people do the budget as well as all the property and everything issues?
Oh, yeah, Bob Davenport. Yeah, most of us belong to Westminster. Bob Davenport does the budget, and so that the treasurer doesn't have to do that, but we literally have 4 people, and one of them is the treasurer, and I haven't been able to do anything. And now all of a sudden I find, of course, because there's nobody else to be the treasurer, it's me. And I pray a lot for the ability to do this.
I'm sorry.
That's a lot for 1 or 2 people.
I
Bob, are you
got-
trying? Bob, you're breaking up as you speak. I don't know.
Can
You probably
I can't
hear
hear
us
Bob.
either.
Can anybody else?
No.
Mhm.
Yeah, he looks frozen again.
Yeah.
I'm really
Other
curious too,
questions?
Jim, what do you do in real life? What's your
Well,
profession?
Well, these days, you just heard it. I spend my time in the
Right,
boiler.
okay.
No,
Yeah, lucky to have you.
Craig and I are both, Greg's a retired engineer and I'm a semi-retired engineer. I think both chemical engineers.
Chemical engineers.
Yeah.
Where'd you work?
Kodak and Ortho Clinical Diagnostics, an
Oh,
offshoot
yeah,
of Kodak.
I've worked for those companies too. I'm a technical writer and an instructional developer, and I worked independently for 40 years. And now I have a full-time job for a company based in the UK and Israel. So it's really interesting. Please pray,
Sounds-
because I have no idea how I'm going to work this in. I just don't.
Okay,
Thanks, man.
leverage.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know that the 5 contingent presbyteries are beginning to discuss how to share some services because there are some difficulties that we're all having. I'm not sure where those conversations are, but I know that they are real and they've been facilitated by a professional. So hopefully that'll help us sort of, where do we need to jump in and help each other as presbyteries?
And I'm curious to know too. I happen to own a lot of property. I own a lot of houses. I kind of collected them. And I have a few suppliers. I try to build a team of a certain select number of suppliers that do everything. So I give them all the work. And I really appreciated it over the 40 years when people did that for me. And I was the only person they ever called. How extensively do you go into getting estimates, or how often do you have a trusted supplier for a tricky thing, for say like the boiler, and you just go to that person?
That's an awesome question. That's always a struggle. And the answer is, for us, we do some of each. Definitely, let's see, how would I say this? So on this, and in the area where you need skilled labor, I tend to stick with one contractor that we trust. You know, I don't like to work necessarily with quotes. I prefer time and materials basis, because that's fairer to both organizations as long as trust has been established. If they spend more than they thought, I expect them to bill us. If they spend less, I don't expect them to bill us. So I ask for an estimate so that I can get approval, but their actual invoices should be based on time and materials. That's the fairest, especially for skilled labor work on old churches, tile roofs, boilers, those kinds of things where you run into stuff. Or you don't if you're very, very lucky. They have to be protected. They have to know that if they run into an issue, independent of their quote, we're still going to compensate them. That establishes trust. So that's the way that I like to play it. On the other hand, a snow plowing contract, I would multi-quote. As example of something that just sort of needs to be done. And if you don't like the job one year, you can go back out and re-quote that. There's only so many carpenters, plasterers, roofers around, and you have to be careful about asking for too many quotes on jobs and then not accepting their quotes, because they've spent money, taking time to put together that quote, and you don't want to necessarily generate a history of, hey, we're just using you to get a second or third quote, but we're actually not going to accept it. You
No,
have to
that's
think
cool.
through that,
That's
unfortunately.
cool. And
Yes.
I fortunately never ran into that in 40 years. I was very lucky, but I got to the point where I told people, I charge you what your budget is. I'm not a mind reader. You tell me. And that worked out great, because actually they were always willing to pay more than I figured they probably could afford. And but whatever they could afford, I like to work, so I don't care. The things like snow plowing in Auburn, New York, that's tough because there aren't that many people who do it. So yeah, so it all depends on some of these rural areas.
Understood.
And then when your people retire, which mine all did, because I'm almost 75, so my people were all older. Some of them, well, many of them passed away. Then I had to build a new team in the last couple of years. And oh boy, that's hard to do. There's so few people around.
Yes.
And so the same thing happens with your church. And I encourage Westminster to not get 3 quotes. Find people who can do the work for you and take the work to them. They will give you your best value all around every single time.
I think that's a rational approach.
Yeah, I'm going to start pushing that very hard. I figure they elected me to push things very hard.
So as you think about your churches or your presbytery, are there practices that you're doing that are not effective, and yet you keep doing them because everybody knows how, or they're actually broken, but you still use them, but they're just not getting you? They're like quadrant 4 things when you really should be in quadrant 1. Are there practices that just aren't working for you, but you don't even know, okay, if I stop doing this, what do I do in that situation?
I learned something this week reading I'm Feeling Lucky, which is the memoir of Google employee 59, Doug Edwards. And one of the people at Google who had the ear of the founders, and they had to have that to get anything done, had an approach to productivity that I thought was stricter than anything I've ever used. And he said that you work on something that's important, that would be something that's in the second quadrant. And then when you get down to the last of it, and this ties into the last 20% can take 80% of the time. If that's really no longer in that second quadrant, drop it and leave it for later. Don't finish the job. Don't finish every job. And that's very hard for me not to do, because I tend to throttle whatever I'm working on. And just my dad was like that. Just go after it and go after it. Drop it, because it's not going to get you anything. Start pulling in the other things that are really bugging you from the other quadrants and start working on those. And of course, what also will happen is that eventually those 2 or 3 leftover things will come to fruition, because they will be mixed with other things, or the supplier will be ready, or whatever it is, or you will be ready to do the detailed work. I've never done that before. So I started it last night, and I'll let you know how it works.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, it is very interesting.
And
right?
Google
Yeah.
didn't follow any rules to get where it got.
Yeah, right. Because if you get 75-80% of the way through a quadrant 1 project, it may not be quadrant 1 anymore. So that's really
That's what he was
interesting.
pointing out. Yes.
Yeah.
What's
that's
left
interesting.
over can be deferred. And
Sure.
sometimes it has to be, because it's such a knotty problem that nobody can solve it. But that's okay, because the base, that means you're not at the root cause at all. And the root cause is going to surface. Somebody will discover it. And then those things will get worked on. And all of a sudden, this issue may just go away, and you can check it off your list because it got taken care of otherwise. Or you may have to go back to it, but probably not. I'm trying this. This is my first time, a newbie at this. So
Well, we will keep you in prayer. All right. I do want to acknowledge it is 10:44. I did put in the chat for you the link to click on for worship. Obviously, that's going to go away when we close out this meeting. But again, the link for the other courses that are in the afternoon are in that general email that got sent out. I got another one yesterday. I hope you all did too. So if not, you got to kind of go back and look for that Congregational Learning Day email, but all the links are in there for the worship at 11 and then the second class that starts at 11:30. So on behalf of Jim, and obviously Jim can speak for himself if he wants here, but thank you all for your attention, for your energy, for coming to this, for your questions, and for what you do as trustees, right? For mixing or bringing together the building and the mission that we're called to as disciples of Christ. It's a complex position to be in. It's one that doesn't always get a whole lot of love because there's always something going wrong with our buildings and our money and our property. So there's always something to do, but thank you for taking all of that work on. I don't know, Jim, did you want to have anything here to say at the end?
Yes, I'm looking forward to our continued collaboration. This was just a start. So I will answer the questions asked here, and who knows where we're going to go from here.
It's good
Thank
to
you
know
very
you're
much for
there.
all the detailed
Thank
information.
you.
You bet.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim and Ted. It was very, very good, very informative.
Thanks. And again, all of this, the slides will be going out, the recording will be made available as well. So you can share it with the other folks in your churches and in your presbytery. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the
Thank
rest of
you.
the day. Get out there and shovel your driveways if you haven't done that already.
It melted.
I know, right? I'm not going to shovel. It's going to melt. All right. Blessings on the day.
Bye.
Thanks, Jim.
You bet.
Thank you.